thank you everyone for being here, for coming back from this very quick break. We have, as we mentioned at the beginning of the day today, this amazing plenary with Onwurah, who is the Shadow Minister for Science, Research, and Digital. So her talk could be on productivity, value added, and the digital economy. And we're very pleased to have her here. She is a fantastic British Labour Party politician. She has served the member of the Parliament for Newcastle upper Tyne Central since 2010 general election. And one thing that's interesting is that her background or her degree is in electrical engineering. But personally, and I guess I echoed some of the conversation we're having before, I find her a superb economist, which is interesting, to see this kind of the economists, they like to compare themselves with engineering, so is a very good question there. But for me, it's always interesting to follow her work. She's always concerned with the social well-being of society as a whole, which for me as an economist is something we should be doing. She's always highlighting, regional economic and social disparities in the UK, giving, of course, special attention to her own constituency. So that's very interesting to follow. The first time I saw her in person was at this kind of ECL EPP workshop in the UK Parliament on the industrial strategy report. Was very compelling. Her talking was very compelling because, again, she was talking about deindustrialization and link that with financialization. That was around 3 years ago, and it was in my mind how articulate, how she knew about both process, and that has been a very incentive for me as an economist. She also is very active in a successful in terms of her political and parliamentary career. She also very active. I follow a little bit her activism in campaigning on gender issues. So it's also very interesting. So, okay, I think I've been talking too much. Without further ado, Jay, the floor is yours. You have, 15 to, if you need more time is fine as well. We have 45 minutes in total allocated to that discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And what a fantastic introduction. And I am always, so it's great to be here. I'll talk about that. But I am always reminded by my economist friends that economics is one of the very few areas which has or certain areas of economics are one of the few that have a worse gender balance than engineering. And it's a particular pleasure to be here today and to have such a fantastic introduction by you, Caroline. I'm very proud of that. Thank you. And as Caroline said, I am the Shadow Digital Science and Technology Minister and the Labour MP for Newcastle Central. And I'm really pleased to be here. I'll say why, but it's Caroline's compliment. It is a compliment to be called, to be said to have economic insight. I first studied economics at university. Now, it was Imperial, and my degree was electrical engineering. But we were obliged then, I hope it still is the case, to choose some humanities to go with our engineering. And I chose to get an economics perspective because I wanted to understand, the relationship between engineering and economics, and the drivers, how economics drove the policy decisions that would impact my profession as an engineer, as I saw my career then. And I have to say, I'll say to you quite clearly, I wasn't very impressed by the maths of the economics we were taught. Too many straight lines, which I didn't believe in. And then as part of my MBA at Manchester, which I studied at the late 90s, and also as head of technology at Ofcom, and I don't know whether we have anyone from many of the regulators, or particularly the competition regulators, in the audience, but in my experience at Ofcom was that it was basically a bunch of engineers, a bunch of lawyers, and a bunch of economists in the same room. Developing policy and insight. And certainly I discovered much more impressive mathematical modeling there, but so impressive, so complex, that I wasn't sure I trusted them as policy drivers either. So you can see from that that I was really intrigued and in some ways relieved by this invitation, because the conference objective to transform macroeconomics and it's back into a policy relevant social science is, is something that I realized in some ways I've sort of been looking for as a politician and even before that. And I think I particularly, felt the lack, if you like, after the financial crisis, and a kind of lack of strong or reported economic voices against, in a robust way, against austerity. So I'm really pleased to be here. I don't. I'm afraid I don't feel I will live up to Carolina's excellent introduction in terms of my economics backgrounds or understanding. But I do want to talk to you about the value and importance of the UK's digital economy and productivity, and ask, or set out sort of the different areas in which I feel, that macroeconomics can help, or economics can help me and the Labour Party and all those who are seeking so robust evidence-based policy objectives and implementation. So, my area and my background's in tech, and my right now, and I'm really pleased that Keir Starmer asked me to lead in digital science and technology, and that is across both departments in the Department of Digital Culture and Media, DCMS, and the Department for Business. So I sit in both of those, our shadow departments. And it's really, the pandemic has brought many areas of my brief, to the forefront of people's lives. And the fact that, this has been is happening digitally as a testimony to that. We also know from figures from Ofcom that the amount of time in the UK we spent online has gone up. It's about, it's about 4 hours a day, and particularly that it's gone up most for those who for older demographics who spent least time online before. The pandemic, and we've seen these figures this week, the pandemic has hit our economy particularly hard. Between April and June, the UK economy was the worst affected of all major economies, and I think it's important to it would be important to try and understand some of the reasons for that. GDP shrank by about a fifth, whereas the average for the OECD was just about a tenth for the same period. But the digital economy, or to put it another way, the parts of the economy which are online, are not about contact, but about face-to-face contact, was the most resilient. So Tech UK, which is the industry body, said that COVID had been a catalyst for the acceleration of the UK's digital transformation. I mean, we already were a digital leader. London-based tech companies attracted over 3 billion of investment in the first half of 2020, which, it's really surprised them to know was outperforming Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, and Tel Aviv put together. And so the UK tech sector went into the crisis in a strong position, and we've seen e-commerce rise by 7 percentage points, peaking at 33% of all UK sales in sort of the height of the pandemic in April. Yet, we know that the wider economy now is still 7% behind where it was in 2019. So, well, that's in September, so before the latest restrictions came into place. And services such as Deliveroo and Just Eat reported surge in business of over 30% more sales compared to 2019. However, of the additional 5 billion that's been added to the UK's e-commerce market, 2 billion of that, so almost half, has gone to Amazon. And Jeff Bezos' personal, so again, not the company, his personal wealth has risen by 75 billion in that period. So, as Shadow Digital Minister and a professional telecoms engineer, have long argued that government needs to do more to ensure a speedier, but I would say more importantly, a fairer transition to a digital economy. And I believe that's now it's a matter of both public health and economic recovery, because digital will be, leading when we build back better, as the phrase goes, a lot of that building back will be driven by or supported by digital platforms. I think it's worth going back a bit to think about how this kind of started, if you like, or started some of the roots. And back in the 90s, when I was working in tech, we often talked about how digital would disrupt business models. And I was director of strategy for a tech startup then, and I had to learn the lovely mediation. And that was used to describe how the power of the internet would take out all the middlemen, occasionally middle women, but not so many of them, reducing costs and liberating value. So you wouldn't need travel agents or estate agents or anyone else's agency. We would be our own agents. And the internet did disintermediate. Travel agents are gone, much reduced. Estate agents are under threat, and news agents make their money out of alcohol sales rather than news. But we didn't become our own agents. Instead, we have new intermediaries, and a new intermediaries such as Uber, as an example of what is called a lean platform that effectively, and in the current climate, seeks to provide greater returns to investors by squeezing increasingly desperate workers. And lean platforms own very few assets, and they claim to have very few employees. If you're an Uber driver, you don't get sick pay or training or any of the rights you would expect if you worked at a company. Yeah. But you do have to own and maintain your own car, the asset, and pay for your own petrol. And Uber, which is the world's largest taxi firm, claims not to own any cars or employ any drivers, though part of that is being challenged by unions and actually in the courts in the UK and in the US. But the fact that it doesn't own any large assets, it doesn't own any cars, is one of the reasons why it has so much cash to put into the bikes that we see, the Uber bikes that we see, particularly around London at the moment. And so this structure, if you like, of that change is one of the reasons why the benefits of the digital revolution or transformation are not being shared. And indeed, some economists argue that the nature of digital drives or can drive inequality. And so to start in terms of where I would seek robust sort of policy making support is to examine is the ways in which macroeconomics can examine and show if that the links between this digital revolution and inequality, intrinsic links, if you like, between that. And of course, one of the reasons for the rising inequality is that not everyone can benefit from the digital economy. Whilst the vast majority of us, as the Ofcom report shows, we use the internet every day, significant minority of the public, up to 10%, are not internet users, either because they haven't got the skills or they haven't got the infrastructure or they haven't got the money to access the infrastructure. And increasingly, this inhibits their ability to participate fully in the social and economic life of our nation. And we're increasingly seeing that, particularly in the public sector, where I see constituents who cannot access universal credit benefits because they can't go online, and that's why they're going to food banks. And that is that's a concrete example of digital making life worse for my constituents. And and it's also as part of the digital divide. That's one digital divide, but new digital divides are opening up all the time. From I gave the example of Amazon. The small businesses who have actually got a footprint in my constituency. They didn't have the ability to respond to the coronavirus pandemic as effectively or as quickly because they didn't have the online footfall, or didn't have online presence and or online footfall, which is effectively driven by Google and Facebook Drive, where online footfall goes. So, we believe access to the internet should be a right, not a privilege, and this means providing people with the skills and confidence to engage in our digital economy, as well as the necessary infrastructure, and ensuring that no one is priced out of important digital products and services. But I guess within a question that I'd like to see economists look at is how are people priced in? So online platforms such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter, they're a central part of our social lives. They determine increasingly how we access news and information or misinformation, how and what we spend our money on, how we contribute to public debate, and how we utilize our spare time. But we have little control over how the content is curated by the tech platforms. All content is curated effectively and delivered to us. And as we use Google to search the internet, Google is staring into the abyss and staring back at us. Google is searching us, taking our data, turning it into advertising revenue, behavioral change, nudges, and obviously not only Google, Facebook, and the other platforms. So I suppose another key question for me is what kind of value is there on that data and the people who drive the internet, because it's people's data that drive the internet, but are not empowered by it. Um, that's another sort of underlying question that I would like to see an economic answer to. So we talked about the internet. It's a general purpose enabling technology which has transformed our lives, but it's not the only one. I think if actually the Internet of Things, is probably going to be the biggest transformation. Internet of Things is really going to be will actually be the biggest transformation in our lives and build on the internet, the transformation the internet has brought. Greater, since electricity and artificial intelligence also, and again working with the Internet of Things and the internet will also have a huge impact on our lives. But how? As Howard Wilson said, and as Carolina alluded to, in his famous White Heat of Technology speech, change requires new social and economic attitudes. Or as the economist Mariana Mazzucato argues, innovation is both a rate and a direction. And the pandemic has had a huge, and people, particularly as you face a second lockdown and ongoing restrictions, it has had a disastrous and tragic effect on our country. But the response to it and building back from it also offers a unique opportunity to change the direction of innovation and our economy so that it benefits communities across our country rather than a narrow elite. And again, to quote Mariana, if you want an economy and a society driven by growth, which is smart, sustainable, and inclusive, and let me tell you, in the Labour Party, we do, then the state investment has to steer the economy in that way. And when it comes to productivity, I think I'm sure we're all aware we have a productivity crisis in this country. Interesting, in the 60s, when we were much more of a manufacturing-based economy, we had the best productivity in Europe. Now, ONS figures show that we have the worst in the G7, and in fact, that the average French, and sort of statistics are you take them with a pinch of salt, but the average French worker produces more, and they're finding more by the end of Thursday than their UK counterpart can in a full week. Okay, these figures are from pre-COVID days. So productivity is at the heart of the day-to-day challenges that we are all facing. And that's also the view of the business leaders who tell me that the government's number one priority, absent COVID, should be improving skills and productivity levels, and that is how we can deliver a high skill, high wage, high economy we want is through higher productivity. And our low productivity is also a contributing factor to social inequality. And Thomas Piketty, the famous economist, believes inequality rises in the absence of economic growth, and that long-term structural growth is possible only because of productivity growth. So he argues that it's the staggering productivity growth we've witnessed over the last 2 centuries that has prevented the collapse of capitalism that Marx predicted. I'd be interested in views on that. But I think it's certainly clear that increasing productivity when the benefits are shared, can deliver this high skill, high growth economy that high skill, high wage economy that we want. Whereas, I'd say what we've had since the 1980s, and the kind of particularly our manufacturing base, is a financialized economy, sort of dominated by market-based trading that creates profits without actually producing anything, you know, anything. So since Thatcher's Big Bang in 1986, the growth of finances has stripped all other UK sectors, and as a percentage of GDP, our financial sector is now larger than that in any other G7 economy. It's one of the reasons why we suffered so greatly from the in the financial crisis crash of the 2007-8. Financialization has been a big success for shareholders and executives, but it is argued that it's severely hampered our ability to collectively produce wealth and prevented the rewards of growth being shared equally. And as long as money changes hands and activity is captured in the figures as creating a productive output with no regard to the social or environmental value that has been added or taken away. And I think I always think it's very interesting, that Adam Smith deliberately excluded caregiving as something of value to be included in productivity. And I always think I think that's particularly amusing because he said it because it's something that was consumed as it was used. He lived his entire life with his mother, who did all the care necessary for him to have an active life as an economist. I would like to understand how that's reflected in his lack of value for the value of care, which I think is something that we need to reflect as we consider productivity, because it certainly is an important support for for driving in productivity. But our the financialization of our economy is also reflected in our country's low spending on research and development. Since the 80s, we have consistently been at or near the bottom of league tables of public and private R&D spend across developed countries. And we have a fantastic science base, and today's conference is part of that. But we have that despite the lack of investment, in particularly private R&D spend in private spend in research and development. And so, in moving away from a manufacturing-led economy, we've sacrificed a reliable source of long-run productivity growth. I'm the shadow science minister, so perhaps with that. But Labour, and I think Keir Starmer in his conference speech, he said, we haven't written the 2024 manifesto yet, but I can tell you what it will sound like. It will sound like the future arriving. We believe that research and development has to be central to our recovery, and the private and public sector investment in R&D needs to rise to at least meet the levels of competing countries. However, we also know that after recession, private sector investment, whatever level it is, tends to fall off a cliff. So one of the other key questions that I'm looking at is how, and like you're supporting, how do we encourage firms to invest in R&D today? So, as a party, we're talking about some of this news, but what we need to see is a positive and practical solution to the challenge of productivity. And it has to be a solution that speaks, to everyone, because people need to be part of that solution. So it needs to speak to the students, today very anxious about their future, to the single mum working 2 minimum wage jobs, and just down the road, the red car steel worker who wants a job to be proud of. We must address the productivity crisis, in a way that inspires the people whose lives we're seeking to change. And again, I think that's a theme for today's or the annual conference. People do not thrive when they're simply seen as units of production, and the only sustainable way, in my view, interesting view, of improving productivity and therefore overall economic conditions in the long run is to improve the skills, living conditions, and economic agency, the term agency, of the people who work, allowing them to reach their full productive and creative potential. So, and I say this as the fourth industrial revolution is beginning. It's already begun, really, but it has at its heart smart factories, intelligent, flexible automation, making manufacturing cheaper, quicker, more efficient, personalized, and reliable. But again, as I said, technology should not be something that is done to people. It must be done for and by people, with working people particularly in mind. So another question that I'm asking is, what are the incentives for firms to invest in automation? not in, as opposed to people. And what can macroeconomics tell us about how to encourage firms to invest in people? And all this has to happen in the context of the climate emergency. I mentioned that so far. And Ed Miliband, our Shadow Secretary of State for business, has called for a zero carbon army to be trained, leading to high-paid, high-skilled jobs to rebuild our economy and build back better. And we're not outliers in this. New Zealand is offering free retraining as part of its COVID-19 recovery plan, as is Sweden. This government's retraining commitment, such as it is, doesn't begin till April. Labour wants to build an innovation nation, so that everybody feels that innovation is part of our country's DNA, and those who lose their jobs over COVID-19 can be an active part of our innovative green future through lifelong learning, retraining, and skills support. So, to conclude, then, fixing our productivity woes requires, I believe it requires us to change how we think about productivity, and that macroeconomics has obviously has a huge role to play in that. The question is whether we see productivity in financialized terms as a measure of how effective workers are producing work returns for investors, or in terms of people who need to be empowered to unlock their productivity capabilities. Now, we believe that wealth is curated by the productive majority, not the privileged few. And then when workers succeed, Britain succeeds. Our vision is a country where every person is provided with the skills, the care, and the technology they need to develop and fulfill their productive capabilities. And our challenge is to do that in the context of the COVID crisis, and not, of course, forgetting Brexit. And I really look forward to hearing what you have to say and working with you, to achieve this aim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chi. I must say, each question you asked us, I started panicking. So like, oh, because they're so key and important. And I do hope macroeconomists will look into them very carefully. So we have a few questions, but of course, I like to be a chair because you can always abuse the role of being a chair. And I just want to make two comments. Which we can discuss a little bit. One is regarding your point on the digital revolution. That actually echoed a discussion we had in the morning, where we saw some slides on the weight of the intangible and digital economy in terms of investment in the UK economy, and how this is large and how we should be looking to that, especially in that COVID-19 kind of scenario. And it's interesting because you complement that discussion, letting us know that there is a distributional issue here. It's not just about looking to these numbers or this data and see, okay, yes, that's the heavy part of the investment in the UK economy, when, as you exposed very clearly, we don't have clarity about who is benefiting from this digital revolution. So I think actually this is a very good point for all of us here to connect between the talk in the morning with Sam Becht, actually, who brought that kind of discussion, and your point. That's very interesting. And if someone in the audience has some views, please contribute it. And a second point, actually, is about what you say regarding the value of data and when it comes to this digital revolution. And I want to mention very quickly a book that is called Zero Marginal Cost Society by I think his name is Jeremy something. I'm very sorry that I don't remember the author. It's a very interesting book. I can't say I agree with everything, but that book actually saying to us something very interesting when you think about the framework we are analyzing price and value, because basically the argument in the book is, while economists have always kind of welcomed a reduction in the marginal costs, they have never actually anticipated the possibility of a technological revolution that may actually bring marginal cost to near zero, right? So making goods and services priceless. So where is the profit in theory, right? So is this kind of a discussion that we are heading to a capitalist society and so on. And the Internet of Things that you mentioned is at the center of the analysis of that book in terms of what's happening here. And the main companies here would be Amazon, Facebook, and etc. And that show us that we have really to, as economists and macroeconomists, to go back to that question of how we understand value and price and etc. So this is just a comment. Again, if someone has more to add, would be amazing. So okay, so I'm gonna stop abusing my role as a chair. We have several questions here now. Okay, so I will start with Daniel Kimons. He's asking, just an observation, should I group three questions and then go for next three? Chi, how do you prefer to do that?
I have time. I think
Okay,
it's probably better to do it one by one, because if I'm going to ask all the, if we've got the time to do that.
perfect. Okay, so let's focus on that. So Daniel is asking us, what's your view on sovereignty in the internet, especially with regards to your comment on the monetization of UK citizen data?
Okay, that's it. Well, that's a great question, which actually, it sort of touches on what we mean by sovereignty. I think that the UK, and I don't know if this is answering the question, but the UK can be, if you like, can be a leader in regulation. I mean, I say that as someone who was head of technology at Ofcom, so where we were leading in terms of regulating the communication sector. And whilst the internet is global and it is distributed, and we need to work certainly with our European Union and other allies in terms of setting up a robust and effective regulatory framework and sort of models for this sort of change. The fact is that money is national, if you like. UK citizens' money, which even though it's many of these services aren't being directly bought, the advertising revenues, etc., which are directed at or local. That means that there is regulatory sort of purchase by any national government, who's in our government, is here to represent the people. So I think what's here, I'm not sure that we're sort of sovereign. We're certainly not sovereign over the internet, but we can certainly put in place a regulatory framework which reflects the rights of our citizens, and we need to have a discussion. And so Labour just closed a consultation called Our Digital Future, but you can look at some of the questions they're asking there, and we'll be producing a report in the next couple of months. But we can look at the challenges and discussion of the challenges and identify the principles by which we regulate these issues. And then I would say, that one of the things that I particularly have been calling for and want to look at is how the how you know, how we define markets, how the competition and I know the Competition and Markets Authority is looking at this. How we define markets when the product and the service is ostensibly free, but you're paying for with your data. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but I don't think the issue of sort of sovereignty in this area we have our government, if you like, is sovereign in reflecting and representing the interests of our people. We should work with other countries to get the best solutions, but we should not be afraid to put in place our own regulatory framework here, which is in the interest of people and also fairer for businesses.
Thank you, Sheet. I have a couple of questions here that I put together because it goes to the productivity crisis. So the first one is from Gary Dominski, and he's asking, isn't there a link between overcoming the digital divide, the core social and educational services available across the nation, north and south, and the productivity crisis? No, that is, we have this productivity crisis as a result of long-term underinvestment across people, communities, and research. And you need to make a sustained long-term commitment to recovering these grounds. And also linked to productivity, I have Neil Glim here asking, I think we also need to question if more productivity is the way forward. if the benefit of higher productivity only accrued to those at the top? So I think these two questions can
Fantastic. Again, really good questions. And so, I think I hope I did say quite clearly that the only sustainable way to increase productivity is through increasing, if you like, the productivity of people. And that is through improving the skills, living conditions, and economic agency. And I think Gary is it absolutely. I'm speaking from Newcastle here, and we have as somebody actually pointed out, the map of COVID transmission rates and the map of child poverty is almost a one-to-one overlay. And so, yeah, the lack. So it is about addressing these long-term issues, these long-term structural inequalities in social, educational infrastructure. But I think saying it's about that long term, and just in the why we want productivity is, I think the question is actually slightly wrong way around. We should stop the benefits of productivity only accruing to a narrow few. We'll try here a system where the benefits of productivity accrue. And that's why we need some support, some economic models or economic levers to achieve that, where the benefits of productivity accrue to everyone. Or Yeah, we need a long-term plan to address this, but there's also some things we can do like short-term, because I don't want this to be something that we sort of kick into the long grass and in 20 years time maybe we'll have a more equal society. No, there are things we need to do now to start achieving that, and one of those things is great access to lifelong learning, and particularly in this time when we're going to have higher levels of unemployment because of COVID, people should be learning, not languishing on the dole. We need to invest in our infrastructure across our country. We need to ensure that there's access to wider range of of particularly science actually research across our country. That science research isn't concentrated just in the Golden Triangle. So to achieve this in the long term, there are many things we need to do in the short term.
Thank you. So, I mean, we still have a little bit of time, and I have three questions here I can probably bring together.
Right.
So one actually goes to the GDP and how we measure the GDP from Carolina Benton. So she's asking, GDP fell massively during the lockdown, but considering the extra unvalued care work done, if GDP valued unpaid care, then maybe it wouldn't have fallen so far, and maybe it would have even risen. So that's a very interesting question that we have been discussing as well in the last 2 days. How we measure, which kind of variables we are measuring in economy, which is not just the issue of a better statistics, but actually what we are deciding to measure here. The other question is from Eliza Maxarley. Apologies if I pronounced the name wrong. So, economic agency is missing from mainstream economic models. How can we change this? Do we need greater policy agency in the north before we see economic investment in people? And I'll be very cheeky and sneak a very last minute one from David Chester, just popped here in a chat box. So he's asking, when we discuss such matters as productivity, surely we need a general macroeconomics simulatable model to examine this. Yet, rebuilding macro has not put sufficient emphasis on this, and why? I guess this question is more, perhaps Angus can step in here. So yes, so that's it. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks. Fantastic questions again. And on care and GDP, I couldn't agree more. And that was the important point I was making about Adam Smith got all his care done for free, and he for some reason didn't value it. But what I would I have spent quite a lot of time on this. Actually, I've discussed this with Foundation for Science, the Royal Society. the OECD, and our character, so I agree that we should. I would like us to look. I certainly like us to look at ways in the UK of integrating care and also about integrating well-being, and that's the New Zealand government has looked at that. But from my understanding, I've spent quite a lot of time talking about this. I mean, what everybody agrees, and I'll characterize it this way. There are huge failings with the way in which GDP is measured, but it is measured by everyone, and so changing it would be just far too difficult. And in terms of internationally, the way in which GDP is measured has been sort of finally, has been this way, and that changing it becomes a kind of political and logistical nightmare. Now, I don't think we should. I don't think that means we should make it say it's out of the question, but I do think it means we should recognise how difficult it may be, and I do hope that economists and others are looking at ways in which this could be done in a way in a way that that the politicians like myself can respond to. But there are so many kind of issues in terms of measuring value, and that's part of what this conference is about, isn't it? Measuring value. That the fact that the world has hit on a measure of value that it agrees on means that there's a huge amount of inertia to overcome in terms of changing that. But I agree, and I also agree. There's a gender issue here because care work is mainly done by for better or for worse. I think it's worse. It's mainly done by women, and that is one of the reasons why it's not valued, pure and simple. And I think increasingly on this, as automation spreads out, we have to look at what it is that people can do that robots and algorithms can't, and care is one of them. And that is where a lot of the jobs of the future will be, as I hope to see automation, artificial intelligence, actually as complements for fulfilling jobs and careers for people. So yes, definitely on care. Agency, yeah, I mean, that's agency and empowerment, for people, for individuals, is is a key part of the way in which in Labour think about these challenges. And I think the question about political agency sort of gets involved in the question about devolution. But I do think that we also have to look at ways in which people-led policy design, policies being designed, and I think that obviously the A level debacle had many problems with it. But one of them was that the people who were taking the A levels weren't included in how that policy was designed. So I think we certainly need greater political agency in the north, but we also need to see better people and focused and led design. And then the final question was about a general macroeconomic, macroeconomic model to examine productivity. I think that's a fair point. I said that sustainable productivity, can only be achieved by investment in skills, empowerment, agency. Clearly, there isn't a model that shows that. It's not one that I'm aware of. Yeah, I think that'd be a challenge, but I think certainly we need productivity is kind of like, as you described it, as it's sort of the holy grail, but it's almost as mysterious as that in terms of what actually concretely drives it. And certainly, as sort of as a having worked in the industry and from my MBA, certainly empowerment and agency are great drivers of productivity, but I'm not aware of a model that reflects that.
Thank you, Chi. That was fascinating, and I do hope every single macroeconomist in the room has taken notes of your questions. So I thank you very much for being here.
Look forward to the answers.
A very thought-provoking discussion, and I hope to see you soon. And Rebuilding Macro, thank you very much for accepting this invitation.